Okay, today is Monday, July 29th, 2013. We are at the Archives Conference Room at Georgia State University Library in Atlanta, Georgia. My name is Hillary Rink. I am doing an oral history interview with Del Hamilton. Welcome, Del. And he is one of the co-founders of Seven Stages, among many other things, and he and Faye Allen have donated the Seven Stages archives to Georgia State University, and this interview will be part of that collection. So, first of all, welcome, Del, and if you can start off giving your full name, your address, and your birthday.
Delbert Warren Hamilton, Scottish background, Hamiltons and Duncans on both sides, and my uncle's name was Delbert, so I was named after him, much to his chagrin, because then he couldn't name his sons Delbert. But my dad stole that from him. And I was born in Youngstown, Ohio, to a working class family. My father was a steel mill worker most of his life. After World War II, got a job in the Youngstown steel mills, and then moved to the first atomic steel mill plant in Fairless Hills, Pennsylvania, in the suburbs of Philadelphia, and that's where we moved when I was 9 or 10.
And when were you born?
1942.
What's your birthday?
November 8th.
November 8th, 1942. Okay, good.
Proudly a Scorpio.
Good. So talk to me. You said both sides of your family are Scottish in their background. Do you know information about when your family came to Ohio? Had your dad grown up there? Is your family long-term Ohio people?
I don't know any of that information, and that's one of the things I've promised myself to find out more about. But neither does anybody else in the family on both sides. But we do know that sometime in the 19th century seems to be when they settled, and then they were intermarried with some Pittsburgh French people, and so it's around the 19th century that they got here.
Okay. When were your parents married? Do you know?
Let's see, I was, my mother was 20 years younger than me, so that must have been around 1922 or so.
And what was your mother's name?
Jean Roberta Duncan.
Okay.
From the famous Duncan family, the gamblers of Youngstown, Ohio. And they're an interesting group of people. My uncle Everett, whom we called Bud, was a magician during the Depression. And he made enough money from his magic act to cover the bills for the entire family.
Wow.
And he bought a house in Youngstown, which he later sold to my dad, and we lived there. And so this was on Bouquet Avenue in Youngstown, Ohio.
Was he able to do this magic and make a living specifically staying in Youngstown, or did he have to travel?
He was a magician. He traveled. During World War II, he was in the Special Forces. And so many of his friends from those days, like Boris Karloff and people like that, came to lunch in my uncle's house, and I got to meet them that way. And he was a magician who mostly made an income through schools. Performances at schools were possible for magicians in those days. And in the early days, I would go with him on some of those gigs, and he had a lot of animals in his magic routine, and so care and setting up of the animals was an important part of it, and I got to do that. So I learned theater from my uncle Bud the magician, and he had cues. He had verbal and nonverbal cues that he would give in his performance, and the roosters and the rabbit and the others would do something in response to those cues.
Yeah.
And it was always amazing to people that he could do that. And the hens were these, what he called Polish hens, were sort of designer hens. I don't know what else to call them, but anyway, they would raise their wings up and flap them slowly at a certain word, and he would ask them questions, and they would pop, pop, pop back and like that. And so even in addition to pulling rabbits out of goldfish bowls and transforming them into goldfish, he would have these Polish hens and little hamsters that he had conversations with during his routine. It was all a sleight of hand trick, as I learned later. Magicians are supposed to keep you distracted while the real magic happens, and so I'm sure it was all part of that.
How old were you when you were helping him out?
Well, I was in, it would have been an early school days, so, 7, 8, like that, 9 years old.
So, growing up in Youngstown as a young child, did you have a lot of interaction with other parts of your family? Did your mother or your father have brothers and sisters that you did a lot with, or did it tend to be more focused around your nuclear family?
Yeah, the Duncan side of the family was very interactive, and they, because we were living in my uncle's home basically, and there was a lot of interaction, and my mother and father went on vacations with my uncle and aunt, for example, on that side of the family. The Hamilton side of the family was a little bit estranged, I suppose. My uncle Dell was a pilot in the Air Force and worked as a corporate exec for GE, which is like the other end of the continuum from the rest of the family. And he's the only one who sort of made it in that way financially and had a decent life, with retirement in Arizona and all that. Everybody else is working class.
Right. Now, did you have brothers and sisters?
I have a sister who's 6 years younger, and she lives in Plattsburgh, New York, with her husband, a Vietnam vet who had one of those horrible experiences in the war and for 40 years has simply not recovered. And so they share this world together where they have a sufficient retirement income, but he can barely move. And so anyway, it's a horrible situation.
Were you and your sister close growing up?
We were not close, no.
Okay. Well, what did you talk to me a little bit about your time as a child? What your interests were? Did you tend to be more of a loner? Did you play with friends a lot? What were your interests in school? Things like that.
I was a gregarious child, I think. I got along easily. I tended to want to be the leader of the groups. Although there were usually stronger physically guys who would challenge me, somehow I knew that I was always the person who could assess the mode well enough that I understood at an intuitive level how to read people. So even as a child, I remember knowing that I had that ability, to understand people's nonverbal cues in a way that maybe many people didn't. And I still have that belief that somehow I'm keener and sharper at at understanding people's behavior. And I suppose that's one reason I eventually ended up in the theater, was because that was a way to use that perceived skill or ability that I had. So as a kid, we had like a neighborhood gang. It wasn't a gang. We didn't cause particular juvenile delinquent moments, but we tried to burn down a bar once. Not as delinquents, but just because it was possible.
How old were you?
I must have been 8 or 9.
So what made you think of wanting to burn down a bar at 8?
Well, that's a good question. I do know that my mother and father were keen on keeping us away from the next door neighbor who ran the bar down the street, not the bar that we burned. And so there was something about alcohol and being Christian that I was learning as a child that was a bad thing to do, and so somehow that led to burning the bar down. So at the corner of our street, it was easy to get all the junk behind this building and just light it afire. And that's what we did, basically, me and another friend named Bobby Gabani. And suddenly there was a fire that we didn't intend and we couldn't put out. So our solution to not being caught was that we both agreed to run back right away in the middle of the afternoon and take a bath. So as you can imagine, both of our parents were curious about why we would decide to take a bath in the middle of the day, but we were sure that if we sat there in the water long enough, we'd get rid of that smoky smell, and nobody would associate us with that burning building at the corner up there. And somehow nobody did. But anyway.
Did they ever find out that it was you and your friend that had
Nobody,
done it?
to my knowledge, nobody ever found out that we were the culprits, including my mother and my father. But I'm not quite sure of that. I can't quite recall the particular events. Just that I did this horrible bad thing and was worried about getting caught, and realized that if I cleansed myself, somehow that was going to keep me pure.
Now, was religion a big part of your family life?
It was.
Can you talk to me a little bit about that?
My mother and father were both in the church. They had also read these two books by Dr. Benjamin Spock about how you're supposed to raise a child in this enlightened era that they were living through. And so the combination of the influence of Spock allowing the kid to have a little more freedom than most parents do, and going to church was sort of the thrust, I think. And
what religion?
Was Protestant, and as I recall, it was a Christ church. So I'm not sure if that was like a denomination that eventually became Baptist or whatever. But in Youngstown, Ohio, I know it was something like Christ Church, and then we became Methodists when we moved to Pennsylvania. And so my mom and dad were very active in the church choir, and I was too, and I was the head of the youth fellowship group, and kind of the head teenage honcho when I was growing up for Methodist kids.
And what was the appeal to you about that? What were you driven by, the religious or the spiritual angle, or was it a social?
I think I was. I didn't understand it in those days. I didn't understand spirituality. I didn't understand religion except what was codified and being given to me. But it all felt good, and it was a way to socialize. I mean, these church groups that were possible in the choir, I could sing well and so be successful. I could be the leader of this or that church need that they would get teenagers to do in the church. So it was fulfilling for me to be a part of the church, because it gave me a way to be with friends and to struggle against this suspicion I had that it was really kind of an outsider and a loner. So in a way, the church provided an avenue for me to stay engaged with other people and not become completely withdrawn in my own stress and anxiety and aloneness.
When did you start feeling this aloneness, or is it something that developed as a teenager, or do you have earlier memories?
It wasn't aloneness like aloneness would lead logically to depression or something like that. It wasn't. It's not that. It was more. It is an awareness of being sort of somehow removed or distant or isolated from others and their intentions and their ways of seeing the world. And so I have this perhaps blown up assessment of my self as one who is both socially engaged, can participate in groups, can direct plays or be an actor in plays or go to church and be active there, and yet also at the same time that I am really a kind of a lone person on a separate continent, an island of myself. So there was always this sensation of aloneness, but it never led to loneliness, at a certain level.
Right.
I mean, I've never felt particularly like I was desperate for friends or people rejected me, or no more than usual anyway.
Right.
And so that I guess that the church created the opportunities for me to find a way into the world around me.
Do you have a memory of when it first dawned on you that you felt that you had this different perception of your place in the world? Is there a certain memory or a certain event that you think, oh, that's when I realized?
That's a very good question. I had this growing awareness that as a kid, that somehow everybody looked to me to make the decisions about should we go this way or that way on the street, or do we go to the movies tonight, or do we go annoy this or that person or like that. And so and I remember thinking, well, do other people, as a kid, do other kids like me have this awareness too? Are they? And so I spent a long time trying to see if people were trying to read other people's behavior like I seemed to be able to do, and I couldn't ever get a sense that they were. And so in that way I thought I was a special person. Rightly, wrongly.
Right. How old were you when your family moved to Pennsylvania?
I think I was 9 or 10, as nearly as I can recall.
And how were you about the move? Was it exciting to you? Did you lament leaving Ohio?
No, it was wonderful to get out of there. It was, in Youngstown, Susan Booth, who's the director at the Alliance, is also from Youngstown. She and I sometimes muse about it, and because she grew up on the other side of the tracks, to moderately wealthy family with decent backgrounds, and That's why she got a good education. And I grew up on the side of the tracks that was the rednecky, where we had many immigrants living in our neighborhoods. A similar story that Faye tells, in fact, her growing up in Brooklyn. But we had Italians and Serbs and Montenegrins and, a bunch of, not just people from other countries, but I was really aware of cultures that they came from, and languages were interesting. So, what's the question?
I was going to say, so you said you were glad to make the move to Pennsylvania.
Yeah. So as I became aware that, this was a sort of a dead-end neighborhood, and, Mahoning Avenue, which is the main street through Youngstown, was kind of on the serious decline. And when I realized, too, that I wasn't really benefiting from going to school. I mean, I was going because I had to, but I wasn't learning much. It was a struggle for my dad to teach me math, or really to stay focused on learning math. And keep getting sidetracked.
Yeah, that's fine. And so then you got to Pennsylvania, and again, the city you moved to was?
Fairless Hills. It was named after a mogul named Benjamin Fairless. So he, along with this man named Levitt, built these suburban areas like Levittown. Fairless Hills was right next to the first Levittown in Pennsylvania. And it was mainly for people who were coming to work at the steel mill. There were tens of thousands of men and women suddenly in that suburban area of Philadelphia.
Right.
And so it was presented, I remember, as an opportunity for education, because it had really smart schools, and they were integrating that we had a black person in our high school. And so that was like a big deal, because in Youngstown you wouldn't have had even one black person. So,
right.
Yeah, so I benefited from going to a great public school in the suburbs of Philadelphia. And I got to meet with lots of kids who were from wealthier families, like Yardley, Pennsylvania. Bucks County, Pennsylvania was where many of my mates came from. So it was the first time I became aware that there were wealthy people in the world, and wealthy kids, too.
Right, right. Did your mother ever work outside the home when you were growing up?
My mother worked at the nut house. That means that it was, she literally sold nuts. She kept them warm and would sell them in little bags. In those days, people would go into the nut house like they would go into Kresge's or whatever store next door. And so she was one of the nut house people. And then she got a job working for AT&T as an operator when we moved to Pennsylvania. And she moved up through the ranks and became a supervisor, and eventually ended up with a fairly decent retirement. So did my father get a decent retirement through U.S. Steel. So, yeah, I think that when my mother got full-time employment in Pennsylvania, that sort of eased any tension in the relationship, in the marriage between her and my father. Yeah, I don't want to get into the personal, moments of shouting and things that mothers and fathers do that kids get to overhear, but there was a lot of that. And I think it got sort of resolved once she, like with most women, had a meaningful life beyond just taking care of me and my sister, and had something genuine that she could point to that she was accomplishing.
Were you close to your parents growing up?
Was I what?
Close to your parents?
No, I was not. I would say, sadly, affection wasn't part of the family structure. I would say probably my memory is that my relationship with my mother was not close. It was very fearful, and she was the one in the twosome who beat me with a belt and stick sometimes. So there was a little violence that went on in that, but never from my father. So my recollection of my father was always that he was the warm one. There were no hugs involved, but he was the one emotionally that I felt connected to. And so,
Wow. before we leave your childhood, I wanted to just circle back. I didn't get a chance to follow up on this. I want to go back to your uncle, the magician, and you said that he had friends like Boris Karloff.
Yeah.
They would come to lunch, and you actually got to meet a few. I would like to hear a little bit more about that. Who else did you get to meet? Who was your favorite sort of famous person that your uncle brought by for lunch?
Well, Boris was the favorite because he would sit me on his knee, and he liked to tell stories. It was just amazing. He would tell very short stories with me sitting on the knee, and almost like the length of a joke sort of story. And he just loved watching my reaction to that, so I certainly remember him. And then, I have some old clippings that my uncle gave me that has some of these famous people in them, and they're not my generation either, so I don't recall the names, but I remember the pictures and who they were, all these sort of vaudeville personalities, because vaudeville had, before World War II, vaudeville was still prominent in our culture, and being a magician, my uncle was part of that, of course. So maybe in the next interview I can review those and mention some of those names. Yeah.
That would be great.
Yeah.
So jumping back now to sort of present, so to speak, we have you in high school in Pennsylvania. Was it a public high school you went to? And
Pennsbury.
What were your activities? What did you do besides classes? Were you involved in theater, sports, band?
Let's see. Good question. I was involved in junior varsity sports. I was not a very large kid, but I liked sports activities. And on the Duncan side of my family, I was, before moving to Pennsylvania, I was a bat boy for a major league, AAA minor league ball club. My uncle, Monty, played on this club, and so he got me the job of being bat boy. So it was the Youngstown Indians. They were affiliated with the Cleveland Indians, and so I got to do a lot of sporting activity like that when I was a kid in Youngstown, and that sort of continued. I was on the wrestling team, played soccer because I was too small for football, and then I broke my collarbone when I was in the junior high school wrestling championship, and so that sort of put the kibosh on any interest I had for future participation in sports. I mean, I liked sports, as I said, but I never really wanted to play on teams. So that was a problem with team sports.
Right.
And as I said, most of my socializing opportunities came about because of my relation with the church. So that meant I didn't have to be worrying about being a sporting person so much.
Right.
And what else? What's the question?
That was just what your interests were. Did you
in sport? Yeah.
Were you in? Was there a school theater group? Were you involved in theater at all at that point in your life?
Yeah, I was beginning to get interested in theater, and I only had one teacher who, in all my life that I can recall, had sort of encouraged me to pursue interests of my own, and one interest was writing. And I remember writing this short story, and she thought it was brilliant and read it to the class. And then she was also the drama teacher, so she cast me in a play. And I played, even though I was small, somehow I looked older, and so I got to play the old characters when I was a young guy. So I played the father in this hillbilly play. And I remember the first lines I ever spoke on stage, which were, rain's coming through the kitchen roof again, Ma, the chickens is getting wet. And when people laughed at that, I thought, wow, if they'll laugh at that, they'll laugh at anything. And so I sort of got realizing that, if I take other people's words, I can turn them into something that is a positive response from people. So I began putting that together in about 12th grade, and that's when I realized, this is something I can pursue. So when I went to undergraduate school at Transylvania in Lexington, Kentucky, then I took a minor in theater and drama to pursue that budding interest, and as it turned out, I had some skills that were worth developing, I think.
Now, toward the end of your high school, when you developed this interest, before that, had you thought about what you wanted to do when you grew up? What were your interests, or what were your thoughts about what you were going to do with your life?
Gosh, no, I wanted to be a teacher, I think, and I went to undergraduate school and took my teacher training, and then taught for 2 years in high school in Louisville, called Thomas Jefferson High School, and then went to graduate school. So I did intend to be a high school teacher, and I didn't really have an intention to be anything other than that, really.
What had prompted your interest in teaching?
Yeah, well, I didn't want to be a preacher. And so I remember thinking to myself at the time, well, teacher sounds like preacher, why didn't I go that way? Or some clever thing like that. But I think also I was serious about it. I wanted to, I felt like I had, because I had this ability to sort of find out what people were really thinking, what was really on their minds, I felt I could mine that and turn that into something that might be useful in a teaching situation. But my problem with being a teacher was that I never felt like I had enough of a body of knowledge to impart to other people. And even when I was teaching in universities or at high school since then, even in workshops, and I know thousands of theater exercises to teach actors, I always feel that I am inadequate in the volume or the quantity of stuff inside me. And so to compensate for that, I think that I try to challenge the students, the people in my workshops, etc., to, in a way, get over my lack of knowledge, and instead I'll present ideas for them to dwell on and ponder that, in my way, are like divert their attention from my ignorance.
Why do you think you feel that way about yourself?
Hillary.
Too much for this?
Yeah, no, I mean, gosh. Why does a person feel inadequate? Well, I suppose, without putting too fine a point on it, I'm quite sure that I learned that I couldn't fulfill the expectations of my mother, no matter what I did, and so that was constantly reinforced. And that sounds really weird and sort of like my mother was psychologically abusing me, and perhaps she was, but I don't mean
right.
that. Like you see in movies or something.
Right.
It wasn't like that. And two, I've always been so deeply impressed by people who can speak well and be sort of friendly or gregarious at the same time. That's a skill I haven't been able to maneuver quite. I can be gregarious, friendly, nice, but it doesn't last long. And so what I have discovered that is some sort of a compensation device. If I can put people on the defensive, then I feel like I can do well. And that's not a good thing for a teacher to be, for a director to be, or anything like that. So it's been a constant struggle, this sensation that somehow there's not much inside me, but I want there to be more than there is, and then I want to share it with others. It's dumb egalitarianism, I would call it.
So you mentioned your university. What year did you graduate high school?
I graduated high school in 1960.
And so then your college degree was 64?
Yes.
And how did you choose to go to Transylvania University in Kentucky?
Well, I wanted to go to a small college because I went to Penn State to look around once and was so intimidated by the thousands and thousands of people there. I knew I couldn't manage it, so it had to be a small school. Also, my grades were very bad. They were not so good. I was not an attentive student in high school. And I needed a scholarship. So it all whittled down. The major universities I was turned down. I think I was accepted at Albright and then at Transylvania. So I chose Transylvania because it was farthest away from where my family was.
So I see from your resume, you as you said, you taught 2 years in Louisville, and was that was at the high school level?
Mm-hmm.
And that was English, correct?
I was the receiving teacher in a then at the time English program for 10th graders. So they would get a 30-minute presentation that was video of an expert English teacher teaching about compound, complex sentences, and then I would take the last 20 minutes of the class to go over it, amplify it, or answer questions and such, and I did that. So I did that, and I also taught remedial English to kids who were not working up to expectations, and of course did the drama program, and I think I was the junior varsity baseball coach.
And you worked there for how long?
2 years.
And what did you do after you?
Then I went to graduate school at the University of Georgia, where I took an MFA. I got a teaching assistantship there, and so they paid me to come and teach some speech classes and to get my degree.
And what had prompted your interest in Georgia? How did the University of Georgia get on your radar screen?
Well, somehow there was a guy I met in Kentucky named Whit Combs, and I've thought about him many times because I don't remember much about him. But somehow he was a colleague, and he found out about the openings at Georgia, these teaching assistantships, and suggested that I try for one, and so I did. And somehow they chose me. I don't know why exactly.
What were your thoughts about moving south?
Oh, yeah. You know, it's interesting because I always imagined I was going to marry a woman named Mary, and Faye, who is my partner now, my wife, her name is Mary. So I sort of had that in the back of my mind as a sort of a joke. I'm looking for Mary in the South or whatever. And I also thought, well, the South is someplace I don't know anything about, and it was a culture that was completely different than the redneck factory culture I had grown up with in Ohio. And I most of all felt the need to get away from my family as far as I could. Not that they were destroying me or anything, but I felt like somehow that was going to change my direction and my perception of the universe. And in fact, I was right, but not for the reasons I thought it was going to be. But yeah, I needed to get away and probably didn't realize that. And that's why I ended up that way.
Given that you were coming to Georgia in the South in the mid-'60s,
Yeah.
how much, if at all, was the whole civil rights issue in your mind? Did you have any thoughts, oh, I'm moving to the South, either that's good or that's bad, or did that play into your thought process?
Yeah. I have mixed thoughts about that, and mixed memories too, I would say, because that's, that is a long while ago for an older fellow like me to recall. But I remember thinking that civil rights was something that I didn't know about because I was a Northerner. That's what I thought at the time. And if I came south, I would learn about that important thing. I would understand about slavery if I met and talked with black people. And that I would find maybe something more meaningful than this sort of aimlessly wandering around and thinking, oh, I want to be a teacher. And in fact, that all happened. When I came south, I did meet a lot of black people. And I hung out mostly with black men and women. And, I've thought about that many times, why that fascination, that particular one. And I think it's because when I was born in Youngstown, I was born on the black side of Youngstown, which is where my grandparents lived, and we lived with them in my early days. So all of my kids' friends growing up before I went to school were all black kids, and I would hang out and eat with them and like that. And so I didn't have this sort of division about black people because somehow I learned it as a kid before I learned the knowledge of it later on. And yes, so let's see what else we're talking about. Why I came south.
I was just curious if that had played into your consciousness when you were thinking of moving south, just given the time period.
Yeah, but I wasn't aware. I don't think I became aware as a human being until I was well into my 20s, after or probably during the graduate school experience at
Yeah, well,
Georgia.
talk to me a little bit about that. How was it being in Athens and at the University of Georgia?
I remember standing in the line in the first anti-Vietnam War demonstration at UGA, standing outside the Student Union building, and we were 8 or 10 of us chanting things, and so the football team lined up across the street and started throwing snowballs at us. This was one of the few days it snowed. And then the person next to me got hit with something because there was a stone in the snowball. So that was one thing that I definitely will never forget about how this group of innocent people can stand there saying their feelings, and a bunch of people will really hate them for that. I didn't understand hatred until I saw that in the eyes of the people throwing snowballs at me. Since then, I've experienced that hatred in many ways in the streets of Belgrade, in demonstrations, and also in other Vietnam anti-war demonstrations I was part of at the time. So I would suppose that being at UGA at that heady time in the 60s, with a lot of, even in Athens, a lot of sort of people interested in how do we get this consciousness thing straightened out? I mean, what is that anyway? And then the Beatles came along and they started singing to us about it. And then there was the use of drugs, and there was a lot of experimentation with that going on. And it all added up to sort of the need to understand the world on your own terms. And as you learn the world is more important than trying to gain the knowledge. Again, back to this quantity of knowledge thing of mine. I mean, I read books and books about anatomy and physiology that you don't have to read when you're an actor, but only because I wanted to consume the knowledge. And not even because I thought it'd be useful to me as an actor, but, I would be interested. I would read something about a spleen, and then suddenly I'm reading an entire book about human anatomy.
Right.
And so the expanding of consciousness in the 60s is what made me realize that, it's not outside knowledge, it's something in here, and I just need to find that out better.
Right. So you were in the MFA program at Georgia. How long was the program? How many years?
It was a 2-year program.
2 years. And what was your area of focus?
It was, and then it wasn't focused, it was just in drama and theater.
Okay.
Now it's broken down into specific majors at that program.
Okay.
And so I was a student, I did the degree work. I wrote a dissertation, which was a play that I wrote for children called, that's another play, the Baba Yaga trilogy, because at the time I was researching about witches in Russia named Baba Yagas who ate children. So I wrote this hysterical, but now I look back on it, was extremely foolish and stupid play about these Baba Yaga witches that decide that they're going to put a potion in the water supply of the village, and so that they could capture all the children and eat them. Well, it was a funny story, but it was pointed out to me by teachers, this is not something we want the children to be going to see and worrying about being eaten by adults and stuff. I didn't even think about that at the time anyway. So I wrote a play and got my MFA, and then I went and taught in Sparta, Georgia, Hancock County, which is the only majority black county in Georgia, you may know.
And when did you get your degree?
I got my degree in 70.
70, okay.
I think so, something like that.
Okay.
And then took a year to finish took a year to go to Sparta, and then I started a PhD program and did all the coursework, got my PhD subject approved, and then I was one of those graduate students who got to a PhD point, and then the major professor got changed, and so the new major professor didn't like the research subject. So I was required to take another year and a half to find a new subject. So this was...
What was your initial subject?
I was doing a dissertation on it was called A Socio-Historical Analysis of the Plays of Elmer Rice. Now, Elmer Rice was a playwright, a Jewish intellectual playwright from the 1910s, teens, and 20s, and he was a sort of a fellow traveler, politically speaking, Marxist intellectually, but not in action. He wasn't a communist. But he wrote the first lawyer plays that became Perry Mason dramas later, called Counselor in Law. And so he had a real perspective about immigrant populations settling in cities and what that means for the culture, and he was writing these wonderful stories about that. Street Scene was his famous one that became an opera. So anyway, I did all the research, went to New York, spent a year and a half gathering all these note cards and this elaborate thing, And then my major professor, who was a real bozo, what shall I say, he was irresponsible in his behavior towards some of the young women. And so they moved him out of the department on the other side of campus, and I got a new guy who said, we'll never have a Marxist analysis of an American playwright on the shelves at UGA while I'm here. So I said, well, it's not really a communist interpretation. It's like, what are social and historical forces that influenced him? But I couldn't persuade him, so I just gave up after all. I did all the coursework for the PhD and all this research, and I just stopped. And then sadly, that major professor, he was driving to Atlanta and was in a car wreck and burned up. So anyway...
Did you maintain your interest in the playwright, though?
A number of times since then, people have asked me to direct his plays, but I've never said yes, not for any reason particularly, but his famous one is called The Adding Machine. It was an expressionistic play in 1923, and they were doing it at Marietta Theater in the Square back when there was a theater there. So no, I haven't directed a play of his.
So you went to Hancock County Schools, and what were you teaching there?
So in my last days at UGA with the MFA, they were looking, Hancock County Schools had gotten a grant from the federal government to find out what was needed to improve the speech-making skills of the black kids in Hancock County. Because although it was a majority black county, there was no major industry there, no employment opportunities, and kids didn't know how to go get jobs, how to speak or anything, and so there was this budding concern at that time, which has now been systematized into programs. And so they hired this woman to come in there and head up this program in speech improvement, and she needed an assistant, so I went down there for half a year, and then she left, and then I took over for a year, and so I was in Hancock County for about a year and a half, and I recorded the voice on tape of every child 6th grade or under in Hancock County, and then had direct feedback with them about their speaking and how they would speak. And I developed this program called Sunday School Speaking, because the kids didn't understand what I was talking about until I told them that you could dress your speech up like you dress yourself up when you go to Sunday school. You can dress your speech up when you go talk to white people and try to get jobs, or when you want to buy something like that. So you're creating a kind of a speech skill that will be acceptable. Well, it was really wrong-headed theory, as I realize now, because it was incomplete in what it did and everything. And all it did was call awareness to the fact that the kids have substandard speaking skills, and there was no suggestion about how to improve that. So anyway, I did that for a year, and that was really heavy duty, as you can imagine. And because I was working primarily for the benefit of black students with a federal grant, I wasn't the friend of the white teachers and population. And so all my friends were black teachers, and they would take me fishing, and they taught me how to hunt, which I was terrible at. And so in that way, I got to understand the culture of African Americans in a way that I never imagined I would.
Mm-hmm. Was religion still a part of your life at this time, church at all?
I began phasing away from religion in my graduate school. Well, really when I was teaching in Louisville. I didn't have a church that I went to sort of pick up from my earlier days. And I got lazy about that need, and then eventually so I got a letter from the choir director of my church in Fairless Hills. And this was when I had just graduated from Transylvania, so in 1964, early 65 maybe. And he was writing this letter to people, members of the church, because for the first time they had been approached by a black couple to be in the choir. And they wanted to know if that was going to be acceptable, that we have black people in the choir. And so I remember writing this snooty letter back to them saying that the church that I learned from wouldn't have even asked that kind of a question. And of course we should, blah, blah, blah. And I quit the church at that time. So it was, just like kind of an immature response to that one thing, I'm sure. But, I used that as the moment when I sort of became unchurchified. And from that point on, I've been in a church occasionally, like for weddings or baptisms. I lied to the Catholic Church when I said I would be a godfather for my brother-in-law's kids, saying I would be a good Catholic. But no, I found that the more I have better conversations about religion when it's not in the institutional context, and when you're dealing more with questions with kids, for example, like what is God, or how do you feel about this or that. It's better if I don't tie it to my poor understanding of institutional religion.
Right. So what was next for you after Hancock County? How long were you there total, and when did you leave?
So Hancock County was sort of the transition between the MFA and the PhD work. And so after Hancock County, I came back, finished that PhD work as I explained it, and then decided to give up on it totally.
And then next for you?
So then I got a job teaching at the Valdosta State College. And it was like a temporary one-year job. It's all coming back to me, the order of things now. So it was in that first year of teaching in Valdosta that all of the mess happened with my major professor and all that happened. So while I was traveling back and forth to UGA and teaching in Valdosta. But it was intended to be a one-year teaching job to replace somebody who was going off for more training. And then the next year somebody else left and I replaced that person. So I was there for 4 years on the faculty, and then...
What were you teaching?
I was teaching theater.
Theater.
Also some speech courses I think were involved, like business speech and group discussion and such like that. So in fact that gave me a good understanding of how people communicate, because I had to learn that in order to teach it. And then of course I did teach acting and directing in the theater courses. And then what happened?
Well, let me just stop you right there.
Okay.
So at Valdosta State, and correct me if I'm wrong, based on what we've talked about so far, that seems like that may be the first place where you spent sort of a significant part of your time in the theater realm, since you were teaching it and I assume producing plays with students, etc. Is that really the first time in your life that you were sort of doing theater more full-time than not?
Yeah, I would say so. I mean, how it works in an MFA theater training program is that it's pretty much like slave labor, and so the faculty has you as a graduate student to be in the productions and to design or act or whatever in the production. So when I was at UGA, I was really very active in a lot of theater activity at the time. But it's true, I really learned best about theater when I was a teacher of it at Valdosta. And that helped to motivate a deeper understanding of theater than I had when I started out teaching. I've heard many teachers that have said that as well, as a matter of fact.
And once you got to Valdosta State, did your interest within the theater realm change from what it had been at UGA and MFA? I mean, for example, did you say, I like acting better, and then once you got into the teaching realm, you decided, there are other aspects of the theater that interest me more?
Yeah. I would say I was more interested in kinds of theater, reasons for theater, function of theater, than I was in how I fit into it. And maybe that's why I think of myself as a generalist and not either an actor or a director or a designer, because I have done all of that, and a playwright. I have a good general understanding of theater, and I think that makes me qualified to do a lot of it. Although I've had good arguments with my colleagues who say that's not the way to think. But I have learned, where are we?
About you said you were more interested in the reasons behind theater, and I'd like to probe that a little bit more, because I think that's interesting, because Faye had some similar type thoughts.
Right. Well, I mean, first of all, in the United States, how does a person or why does a person decide to become an artist? That's a wonderful question. Not just a theater artist, but a visual artist, a sculptor, a poet, a musician. I mean, what is it in our culture that still encourages and permits that to happen? Even when all odds say that you shouldn't do that, you should pursue a life that's going to lead you to a nice, successful retirement, and along the way you should earn a lot of money. So if you don't want to follow those belief systems, then you sort of have to create your own. And I found that I created a system of believing in myself and believing in other people and believing the work I do. That system was created by me as I became more informed about the nature of the work I was doing, who the people are I'm doing it with, and who I am as a person. And so they sort of all dovetailed. That process of learning about myself and learning about theater and learning about other people all kind of came together, and I realized that that's really what was of interest to me. I was not interested in a track of going to New York and New York theater, or going to LA and becoming a film actor. For lots of reasons, that wasn't not appealing to me. So I spent years sort of doing what I would call sort of personal cultural research, trying to understand who I am as a human being and why I can take the liberty of saying that I am an artist. So, what is an artist in today's culture? How does a person decide to set down roots in a community? Those were the questions of interest to me. So rather than taking the route that many of my colleagues take, which is, let's say you come to Atlanta or Memphis or LA and you sort of build a reputation for yourself, you make some projects happen. If you're pretty good, then you can go to another city and do that for a few years, and then eventually you're on the road to New York success or film success if you get an agent. But if you decide not to do that, if you want to live in a community and see the community develop, you want to put down your roots there and be part of that over a long period of time. I decided to do that very early in the 70s and really make it my life's experiment. And so it was a conscious decision that I made many times, because there were lots of times when I wondered about it. But you know, there was also a body of work developing that encouraged that at the time too, and much of this came from Alternate Roots, and then later the National Performance Network, which are two organizations that have influenced Southern artists, especially Southern performance artists. And so this movement was an extension of the WPA movement from the 30s, and it started by Dudley Koch, who was the director of Apple Shop in Whitesburg, Kentucky, and he organized a group of Southern theaters in the middle 1970s, and this organization still exists. And the goal is to see how we can create artists who decide not to take the institutional route, but who do want to develop their community. In the case of Apple Shop, they developed a community center there that is the major employer for the county in Whitesburg, similar to what's happened in Colquitt. I think it's Colquitt County, where they've developed a performance down there that is now the main source of income for the county.
Right.
So
that's here in Georgia.
In Georgia.
Right.
So you know, there was and still is a movement that was active by people who have a sort of a consciousness of who they are and how they want to fit into the world, who want to stay in a community, develop the kids that work there, develop performances that have a particular point of view, and encourage people in audiences to come and experience all of that over a long period of time. And that's kind of what Faye and I came up with when we decided we wanted to make 7 stages.
Right.
Yeah.
So you said you were at Valdosta State for 4 years, so then you would have finished up then in what year?
Yeah.
Mid-70s?
70.
4 or 5?
Well, Yeah, 74 or 5.
Okay. So then after that, is that at that point is when you made this decision that you wanted to do the sort of stay in one place, make your artist career then, or what happened after Valdosta?
So I was after the 4 years of replacing somebody who was off for a year on sabbatical.
Mm-hmm.
The opportunity came about to start an art commission in Lowndes County, which is where Valdosta is. And so the county manager and some wealthy people asked me if I would take it on. So for a year I stayed there as the director of started the Lowndes County Arts Council. And the reason I wanted to do that was because the federal government had at the time a grant program called CETA, which I think means Comprehensive Employment Training Act. And it was a government program that provides employment opportunities to city and county governments, and it was kind of a across the board and fill in the gaps of what nonprofits don't do kind of program. And so somebody somewhere figured out, well, we can hire artists if we do this. So I got word of that too, and I proposed, well, let's hire young artists who are extremely accomplished, who could be teachers, who would be teachers of dance, theater, music, poetry. I think there was a fifth area, video, maybe a film, I think. And so yes, the guy said, that's a good idea. So he got 2 years worth of CETA grant money, and I got to hire artists and interview people, and they came, lived in Valdosta. We were in this old building, a school building that had been emptied, and we took that over, and it became studio space and performance space. So it was a really wonderful thing that happened. And that set the stage for coming to Atlanta, because in the back of my mind coming here was, well, we can get some money from the CETA program to start a theater group here in Atlanta. So then backing up from that, the decision to leave Valdosta and come here was because I was in a class teaching, and a student said, why are we reading this book called, at the time it was called The Banquet Years, and learning about 19th century Europe? Shouldn't we be going out doing this thing called theater? And it was like one of those moments I said, duh, of course. And so I gave it all up. I took a handful of those students, and we came to Atlanta and started Theatrical Outfit. So that was in 1976.
And what made you decide to bring the group and create Theatrical Outfit in Atlanta versus doing it there in Lowndes County?
Yeah, well, so I was going through a personal crisis at the time. A person I was living with had decided that didn't work, and the jobs were uncertain in Atlanta, and so I got in my Volkswagen van and just drove across country. And I went to Jacksonville first, and to Tucson second. The reason I stopped at Tucson was because the van blew up, so I couldn't get any further. But those were two cities that we had targeted to investigate, and Atlanta. And Atlanta was the only one that had a sort of a budding system of cultural support. Shirley Franklin at the time was cultural affairs director. Michael Lomax had just taken over, and he was all big in the arts. And so, they said, I remember this guy, Rob Rivers, you may know him. He was the head of the water department for decades here in Atlanta. He was in cultural affairs. He said, sure, come here. We'll give you money. Just come here. And so, sure enough, we did. And we got some CETA money from the county and from the city. And then I met a woman named Celeste Miller. And she had a company, a dancer, called Gypsy Rainbow Dance Theater. So we decided that we would combine theater company and dance company because we wanted to be an interdisciplinary group. And that's when Theatrical Outfit was born at Manuel's one night. And so,
and again, that year was?
That would have been 1975, because our first year was 76.
Okay. And what was your mission for Theatrical Outfit when you created it? What was your thing you wanted to achieve?
Theatrical Outfit was set up to be a kind of a collective, not just in the way that you make the performance, but in your living accommodation. So we rented a house on Fairview, and we all lived in that house, 12 of us. And we ate food there, we slept there, and for better or worse, we had love affairs and wrote poems for one another. We were very rigid and disciplined. We would get up at 8 had breakfast at 9. We worked for 3 hours on exercises, had a peanut butter and jelly lunch, and then we would call funders and programmers, and then have performances and rehearsals in the evening. In the early days, the outfit wasn't a theater per se, but it was a group that went to residencies. So a lot of our work was done in institutions like prisons, old folk homes, and so we would call up these prisons and go through the various bureaucratic levels to finally get permission to walk through the gates. And then the performance that we showed to the residents was our experience of getting to meet them. So there are always these clown characters on the phone with cigars and things that made it difficult. And we were very well liked by the residents, but not so much so by the people in charge. So that was about about a year and a half worth of work. And then we wanted to start producing plays in the outfit, and which we did. Elise Witt taught music, Celeste taught movement, I taught acting, and we had these intense daily exercises that were like that. We created plays based on astrology, and each of us were astrological characters. I played Pluto a lot. And
so were most of the plays that you produced ones that your collective wrote?
Yes, entirely.
Entirely.
Until the very end of the outfit, at the end of the second year, we did Macbeth. And you may know Macbeth has a very checkered history of making theater companies fail. And so it was a really outstanding production, and it toured up the East Coast and ended up in New York. And it was on that tour that everything came apart emotionally and spiritually, and we ended the outfit at that tour.
And that would have been what year?
78.
Okay.
Something like that.
Okay.
And then several members of the outfit went away. Several stayed and kept the outfit going to various incarnations of what it is now.
So then, how did Faye come into your life, and how did you transition from theatrical outfit to 7 Stages?
Yeah, I'm sure this is one of Faye's favorite stories of how we met. So there was this space at the corner of St. Charles and Virginia Avenue. So behind it was a laundromat, which had been converted by another theater company at the time, a youth theater called Open City, into a small performance space. And then Celeste took the space over, and she had it upstairs, her studio, and then downstairs was a performance space. So the outfit took over that space along with Celeste, and so we had an upspace, sort of a rehearsal studio and a work studio is what we had, and then a place to do business. So I'm sorry, I lost track of the question again.
No, that's fine. How did you and Faye meet, and
yes, so she
how
was
did
building
you transition to 7 Stages?
They were doing their final performance, and she and her partners were in there building the scenery, and we were coming in there to measure the space because we were going to take it over as soon as they were done. So they didn't like that whole idea, but that's when we kind of met. And then her story is that later she saw me in a performance of David Mamet's Sexual Perversity in Chicago, in which I played this horrible character named Bernie Litko, this really, really awful person. But she said she fell for me then on stage, so she managed to meet me afterwards. We had some dates, and that's it.
And then how did the genesis of 7 Stages come about then between the two of you?
After the outfit closed, that version of the outfit closed, Faye and I had a couple of friends, and we were looking for a storefront to start another theater, and we wanted to make it have a sort of a precise definition or grounding, and so we spent a lot of time coming up with a mission statement that sort of precisely said what we wanted our theater to be. And in fact, we still use that mission statement today. So we did some, did she tell you about the I Ching?
A little bit, but I would like to get your take. And also, if you can sort of give us a very broad view of the mission statement.
Yeah.
As you talk about the I Ching.
Well, the particular view from which a broader view might be taken is that we Seven Stages does plays that have a social, political, or spiritual content. Now, I think as many people have said, most plays have those things in them somewhere or another. But what we mean is that we want the artists involved to talk about the subjects and the issues in the play, and then I think that better informs the performance, so the audience goes away also wanting to talk about that. My belief is that a lot of times people don't like theater because they fall asleep in the middle of something, and they don't want to feel inferior, or they hate that they fell asleep in the theater like that. And it's not a good thing when I see a guy nod out with his wife or something, because I think he wants to be with us. So I think a lot of times it's because in the process of making the theater, the artists don't take the time to discuss the issues thoroughly, and they take it a lot for granted. In the case of the unbridled ambition of Macbeth, for example, and you have to discuss all those issues connected to the greater forces in the universe that may be controlling his behavior, or his wife's interaction with him, or what does unbridled ambition mean? Those are subjects that have to be discussed, not necessarily in an intellectual, snooty, snuffy way either. And so when that doesn't happen, then I think the performance is empty, and that's why people go to sleep, honestly. That and the sound of their voices can lull them to sleep, the actors' voices. So we wanted a performance that was so compelling that audiences understood their involvement, their relationship to the ideas involved or the emotions involved, so that it wasn't just a kind of a spectator sport, but an active engagement of the spectators. So that meant the aesthetic for the theater had to be one in which the psychic barrier that separates performers and audience gets broken down. So every performance that we do at Seven Stages, I make a point of talking to the directors and the playwrights and say, what is it that you're trying to do that can't be done in realistic theater? Because that's where we want to focus all of our concentration and attention. So the I Ching experiment confirmed that was the right approach. So the I Ching is a Oriental system of philosophy. It has 3 coins, and you throw the coins like dice, and you add up the numbers. And then there's another book for people who are not informed, like me, and you look up what those numbers mean. And our number was 23. And in the description of what is the number 23, there are these kind of general but poetic descriptions that may define consciousness and life. For example, the number 23, if you look it up in the book, we doing okay?
Yeah, we're fine.
The descriptions were the turning point, a volcano about to erupt, a trembling underneath the surface of the water, and a person goes through 7 stages to change his or her consciousness. And that's how we thought about the theater at the time. We really thought that the culture was at a turning point, and that we needed to be part of causing people to become aware of who they were and where they fit in. And therefore, of course, we were always involved in issues of racism and the early AIDS movement. I remember one of the horrible things that happened when AIDS first came to Atlanta was that Grady Hospital was sort of reluctantly the only place where AIDS patients would go in those days. And so we had an actor named Dale, and we were doing a play that I wrote, a Mama Dada play, and so Dale was learning this song, and suddenly he just sort of collapsed downward. And we went over to him, and we noticed these sort of dark lesions, and he didn't know what they were either. They just occurred. So, yes, Grady took him that night to the hospital, and next morning they kicked him out, along with a dozen or so other gay men who also had the same suspicious, they didn't have any idea what it was, except that they couldn't have it in their clinic, and so they forced them on the street. And so Dale came back to rehearsal that night, and we didn't expect him. A little bit weaker, and he eventually, of course, passed away. The fact of his having AIDS and our not understanding it had an impact on how we did that performance. And, then I began realizing, well, so much of what we do has to do with we as artists, what we do has to do with those with whom we engage. And so I really took seriously the fact that we have to get directors and playwrights who are thinking along consciousness terms and not how do I improve my career terms. So the benefit was that we did wonderful plays with great people over the years. The downside is that we just couldn't figure out a way to pay the bills and pay people properly for their good work.
How did you find the audience to engage or to, for lack of a better word, buy into your philosophy about what theater should be? Did you have a sense through the years that the audiences at Seven Stages sort of approached the theater in the way you approached it? And how do you think in general, sort of for the Atlanta theater world, how that sort of philosophy or that view of what theater should be fits into the broader theatrical world here?
Well, that's a good question. There's a part of me that loves the notion of a theater that deliberately puts itself down some dark alley somewhere and puts up no signs and doesn't announce about performances and makes it really hard for the audience to find them. There's a part of me that loves making the experience of art be a work participation requirement. But the reality is that people need information, and they don't need to worry about that so much as what they should worry about once they get in the door. And so I'm sorry.
No, that's fine. So how, over the years, how have you seen or felt your audiences at Seven Stages in terms of engaging on sort of the level of the theater and the philosophy of the theater that you had? Did you get a sense that your audiences sort of got into that as well?
Yeah. I think I have learned to rely on the directors and the project leaders and conversations that Faye and I have with them about the spiritual values inherent in the work, or what does it have to do with this or that social issue, so that the audience can walk away with a clearer head about it. Interacting with people who share that way of thinking about how art works in the community has helped us come up with the ideas and the plays that we've done. The audience participation, at that level, is that the work that we have managed to generate, those friends who have a sort of a like-minded view of the world, is that the audiences have found us. Because those audience people are also interested in those subjects. And honestly, there's not a lot around in the community where you can really go into some sort of detail to learn about that. I mean, you might go to a conference or a panel discussion about this or that, or maybe Actors Express would have a show about something that's useful or something like that. But finding an ongoing audience that is interested in the kind of work that I'm interested in has been a challenge that I'm not sure I've met. And we have faithful people who come to the theater to everything. Then we have people who come see most things. And then we have most of our audience, which is new people. And that's probably as it ought to be. We don't have the problem of old graying audiences at Seven Stages, but we do have some old gray people there, like me, on a regular basis. But, we're constantly trying to find a way to get new audiences. And
do you think,
happily for us, young people today are more attuned to our mission and what we're doing in the community than any generation of audiences has been in the 35 years we've been doing it.
What do you think's driving that?
I don't know. I hate to say it's technology. I hate to say that they're better informed because of the internet and like that, but I don't know how else to explain it, because we just went through an experience with 40 teenagers in our youth program, Youth Creates. And I mean, these kids are so far advanced over what I was. I mean, I explained sort of jokingly that I don't feel like I developed as a conscious person until I was well into my 20s, but that's only partly a little joke. I mean, it's really true. And these kids I mean, in a way, they're far beyond where I'm thinking in terms of who are they and how do they fit in and what are they supposed to do with their lives. And boy, so I don't know the answer to that. I don't think, are they smarter? What else would it be other than technology? Maybe they have better friends, better acquaintances, better parents. I don't know.
Do you think this challenge that you at Seven Stages faced in terms of you said growing the audience that might sort of have the same philosophy you do you think that's a characteristic that's unique to Atlanta, or do you think this is something that's sort of common across the theater world in other cities?
It's common across the theater world in the U.S. and also around the world. I was in Tel Aviv in December, and I was so impressed with the audiences in every theater. I mean, I went to this one theater, the Cameri Theater, and it's 5 levels of theaters, 5 stories, and every one of them was filled up with people, and mostly it was old people. But then there were also other theaters, like I would say it's like the equivalent of the Alliance was the Cameri Theater I just described, and then they have theaters like Seven Stages that are smaller, and they're filled with young people. So the Cameri does a particular kind of play, sort of realistic, naturalistic plays, and the younger appealing theaters are doing plays more about ideas and, you know, socializing questions that come up through social networking. So, but I haven't yet found a theater anywhere in the world where young and old people are getting together. Seven Stages maybe has had more luck than most, and it is luck, getting people from different generations, different races, different cultural perspectives, LGBT people. I mean, if you look at our audience, you see that, and many theater directors aren't jealous of that, as a matter of fact. But it's always unpredictable, and we never know how we're going to get people, and it's usually not what we think is what we learn.
What are some of the social issues or areas of our culture that you feel proudest in terms of Seven Stages having addressed through its work?
Whoa. Well, maybe the most important sort of area would be something related to racism. And that's largely because over the years we have done so many plays about that and so many configurations. One of our playwrights in residence, Robert Earl Price, and I have done at least a half dozen plays about the subject of racism. And Robert writes from the perspective of African American musicians. So his plays are about important musicians in the jazz culture, like Thelonious Monk, for example. We did a play called Blue Monk. He wrote about Monk's ideas and who he was as a person. And it was very popular. We did it for the Olympics here. And then we also went to Johannesburg and did it down there with a South African cast, and where they learned to love Thelonious Monk as a musician. So, hey, I keep getting in the middle of these sentences and then going up, as they say.
No, that's fine. That actually, I'm glad you mentioned South Africa, because that is one thing that is, and I'm not going to read through the list here because people can find that in the documentation in the archives. But Seven Stages has done a lot of work internationally and worked with a lot of international artists from all areas of the globe. And I want to get a little understanding of how that started out. Was it intentional from the beginning, or did it just sort of serendipitously become part of your existence at Seven Stages? Because I think probably more so than a lot of other theaters in the city, you guys have a lot more interaction on an international level.
Right. Starting an international component for a small nonprofit theater is not something I would suggest for anybody to try. And when we started out that way, it wasn't with the idea that we're going to create an international theater. In fact, the corporate head of Lufthansa at the time came, saw one of our plays, and liked it a lot. And we got to talking about how Germany was the place where the greatest theater in the world is. And he said, well, would you like to go see something? And it was from that question on that we realized we were going to be an international theater. So he made access possible.
And roughly when was this? How long into the existence of the theater?
I think it would have been the early 80s.
Okay.
So it was only a few years after we started the theater that this opportunity occurred, and maybe it was like 85 or so when we started doing German plays. So we traveled to Germany because we had the Lufthansa tickets for free, if you can imagine. Not only free business class in the early days. I hope Lufthansa, please understand, I don't think you will give those things away today, but it was so important to our development. And so we began meeting artists in various cities and translators, and then began being approached by playwrights and directors who wanted German plays to be done here. And so next thing we knew, the German consul was offering funds to pay for translations, and we were doing a German play every year, every 2 years for a number of years. And during that process of actually creating the work with visitors from Germany coming to Atlanta to be in residence, we realized, well, this is something that no other theater does, and that we can probably do pretty well. And besides, we don't have the resources to take vacations. So if we can get other countries to pay our way, we'll do that. And for the first 10 years, that worked really well. But then everybody started hearing about Seven Stages, and they meaning consuls and agencies, embassies, began being overwhelmed with these requests, and now, so we had to back off of those. But there were foundations that have an interest in international activities, and we began to approach them to support the good ideas that I had or Faye had, or that our directors or playwrights in other countries would have. We spread out from Germany and went to visit many countries based on who we knew there and who could work out an invitation for us to get there. And usually whenever we got to a given country, a project would emerge and we would continue it. So yes, South Africa, Mexico, many South American countries, many European countries, Russia, many groups in the Balkans, and a long-term relationship with Dach Theater in Belgrade has resulted from these trips. And it almost always involves me or Faye or both of us going there and sort of finding our way around the city, reading Cyrillic alphabet letters and knocking on doors and saying, are you a theater and do you want us to come watch you, and can we talk about over lunch? So I'm asked a lot by other small theaters, how did you get to become an international theater, and how can we find the money to do that? And the answer is you have to, I think, invest on your own. In the first trips, it's going to cost some money to get to be an international theater.
Now, what types of work would you do? Would most of the work that Seven Stages was involved with, would it happen in the country, or were you bringing artists back here to produce on your stage here in Atlanta, or was it all of the above?
Yeah, in the first 15 years or so, it was work, international work was mostly us bringing in playwright or director to Atlanta, and then they would work with Atlanta artists, and that's a very convenient way because we got a lot of support from artists that way, and then eventually we started making relationships with artists in other countries, so they would invite us to be in their theater or to do workshops. In the case of Dach Theater, I think they've done 5 U.S. tours that we have organized for them, mostly to universities like in Kansas or places like that still have the money to pay for such things. But we've also created 2 performances together, and we're working on a third one coming up right now. And these performances have traveled in Europe and in the U.S. So I expect that will continue beyond this particular relationship. The first, I think Faye mentioned, she mentioned this to you too, but I'll give you my version of it. In the early days of working with Dach, we were interested in issues connected to racism and how people of color and white people have problems in this country. And our friends from the Balkans were fascinated with that. Of course, they don't have that experience. There are no black people to speak of who live in the Balkans countries, so their experience of racism is completely different from ours, which is based on the physical perception of a person's skin. And so I remember we had this dramaturg from Belgrade here, and she's a very intellectual, smart woman. And then we had this other local woman, a poet there. And so they were talking about the differences between people and what causes them. And the Americans said, well, of course, it's physical, it's the skin. I mean, that's how we determine racism and all the problems in this country. No, this person over here said, well, with us, it's religion. It's the Orthodox versus the Roman Catholics that are causing the problem in our country. And I said, well, what about Muslims? Well, the Muslims are tolerated by us all because nobody takes them seriously because they're not religious in the way the Muslims are in other Muslim countries. And so, but to me, that was so interesting that they thought about the conflict between Orthodox and Catholic churches, that was somehow racist. It wasn't. I mean, I don't know how. I've been to both Catholic, Roman, and Orthodox churches in those countries, and the people that go there look exactly like one another. They're all white and sort of Slavic looking, sturdy types, but somehow they see a racial distinction between the two sects. So that was kind of phenomenal to me, and yeah. So many of the plays that we've done since then have involved lots of conversations about race with our friends from abroad in that way.
One thing I wanted to get your perceptions on was just how was it, if Seven Stages started in 78, I think you produced your first play in 79, and you and Faye have just now sort of transitioned out of full-time day-to-day involvement, and it's 2013. You've got over 30 years of your work life and your personal life being completely intertwined. Talk to me a little bit about that.
I don't recommend it. I don't say this. I guess I have learned about life that somehow this thing called life is a process. It's not like a thing you get to and then you have life. And so everything about my life is a process, including the creation of theater, the making of a performance, or the falling in love with another person. And so I think when the outfit collapsed, that was an extremely emotionally vulnerable time for me, and I was really kind of scary that I would throw myself into a relationship that would be sort of transitional to cover my emotional need at the time. And so when I met Faye, and I was overwhelmed with these senses of, wow, I've never had before. I was really resistant and reluctant to become involved because I was afraid it was in the context of a situation that wasn't ready yet. And yet, she worked some magic on me. She's a witch, and she did some spells and taught me about astrology and such. And and then she had in the back of her house a sweat lodge that she and some of her women friends had built. And so she took me in there and had me sweat a few times with her. And all of those kind of odd experiences that she introduced me to, which I would say was sort of woman-centered at the time, now that I look back on it. But she kind of brought me into it, and I guess I realized she would be a good partner for me at first. And then as we became good partners and we got Seven Stages going, I realized that our relationship was getting deeper too, and it was becoming like a real meaningful love experience. I didn't really think I'd ever have one like that. So 34 years later, we got married.
What prompted the marriage after, or I guess not what prompted the marriage, I could guess after that long, maybe financial reasons, but why not the marriage earlier?
Well, that's a good way to ask it. We did not think about it particularly earlier. And there was no need for us to be married. Though we never had a conversation about do we want to have children or anything like that. It was not really something we wanted to do, either one of us, and so there wasn't really any need to talk about being married particularly. In our business, it didn't matter that we were partners. Nobody cares about that at Seven Stages, and so I think that was part of it. But then also, we talked for a long time because Faye got to be an Irish citizen, because of her background. So we thought, well, that'd be a good way for me to be an Irish citizen if we got married. But then the year before we tried to pull that scam off, they changed the law in Ireland. So now I have to be in residence, even though she's a citizen. I have to be there for 3 months and then apply for citizenship. And I haven't found a time when I can be there for 3 months to do that. So we found that out when we went to Ireland to try to get married. So after being mildly scolded by the Irish bureaucracy, we went and got married anyway because we knew enough people and we knew how to buy champagne and oysters. So we got married on the west coast of Ireland, and then a year later we came back here and got married in downtown Decatur by a magistrate, and then decided to have a fundraiser for 7 Stages to get married again. And we may do it yet again because everybody had a good time at the fundraiser.
That's good. I have 2 other things I wanted to touch on before we wrapped up. One, this is just, there's not obviously a right or wrong answer. I'm just curious if someone approached you on the street and said, over your time at 7 Stages, what is a particularly memorable production or project that you worked on? It doesn't have to be necessarily the most successful. Maybe it's one that went terribly wrong, but one that really seizes your memory as that this is something I will always remember that I did at 7 Stages.
Mm-hmm. Happily, I can refer to many, many projects, time periods like that through my association with 7 Stages. It's been such a fulfilling opportunity because I created it and I tapped into it over a long period of time, and I kept the opportunity alive in the sense that it created opportunities for other people too, and that was fulfilling. And so, it's like this constant, like an ocean of waves that of opportunities for myself and awareness of myself and others and seeing them smile and all like that. So it's the overall sensation I have about that is fulfilling. And I had so many bad experiences and good ones. Let's see. So here's a good one. So when we were in a storefront on Moreland Avenue, 430 Moreland, we had a director who was the first director for Jim Grimsley's plays, Steve Kent from L.A. And so Steve came in and introduced this play by Dina Metzger. And this has to do with what I was talking about earlier about how artists who buy into our mission talk to their artist friends and they create projects that we will consider. So his friend Dina Metzger is and was at the time a very well-known therapist in Topanga Canyon in LA, and she was helping people heal in so many deeper ways than I'd ever heard about, beyond psychology. And so she wrote this play. Her famous book is called Tree. You may have seen it. She had a breast removed, so she had a tattoo replacing the breast, and she's standing up there like this, sort of saying to the world, I'm here anyway. So Dina was a therapist who published a number of books and wrote this play called The Dreams Against the State. Dreams Against the State was set some sort of fictional future where dreaming was against the law. And so we converted the theater into a safe house for dreamers. And each character would dream a famous personality from history, like Emma Goldman or Karl Marx. I played the last survivor of the Jewish ghetto, so I was conjuring all these spirits up who were in the ghetto before that destruction. And so it was a really heady and difficult time for us all because as actors we were deep into Dina's way of thinking about these characters sort of therapeutically, and so they would sort of have their dreams and then they would interact and then the dreams would interact and you never knew quite where you were. And so we completely renovated the theater to make this dreamscape, including cutting holes in the front for windows so actors could walk by and talk from the street into the theater and like that. and we would left the front windows open so spectators could look in while the performance was going on. And I guess I liked that experience because it was it opened so many doors for me about what you're allowed to do in theater. You can chop holes in walls, and people will let you do that. And you can talk about dreams in ways that are deeper and more profound than people will acknowledge in a regular conversation. So that sort of opened doors for me. And there was also a personal crisis time, and Dina helped me through some relationships with other people that were having difficulties with me. And so that's when I learned one of the most important lessons of my life, which was that I need to continue to forgive people for not being what I want them to be. And I can't tell you how many times I've had to remind myself of that.
That's useful advice for anybody.
Yeah, exactly.
So the last thing I wanted to just sort of get a little bit of feel on, and it may be too soon. As I said, you and Faye have transitioned out of day-to-day involvement with the theater very, very recently, within the last month or so. How are you feeling about that? Has it hit you yet, given that you've spent the last 30-plus years physically at Seven Stages a lot of the day, hours and hours and hours? How do you feel about knowing that going forward you're not going to be there at the same level of intensity?
It scares me a lot, to be perfectly honest, because so much of my emotional daily life and experience is in that building and walking in there and being known and knowing people. My mentor is Ellen Stewart from New York, and she had her theater was La Mama. She started it in the 1950s because her brother Paul Foster wanted to be a playwright and couldn't get his plays done, so she rented a storefront theater, and she was, I think, an assistant for Coco Chanel at the time. She quit that job and costumed his play, and she has been La Mama ever since. And she's probably the most famous international theater in the world.
And where is this?
It's on East 4th Street in New York.
Okay.
And her building it's called La Mama ETC, Experimental Theater Club. And, her message, she's a black woman. When I first met her, she must have been 80 or so. And she came to Atlanta and saw a number of our plays and advised Faye and I a lot. And so I brought her down here to see a play by Pearl Clegg, because I thought she and Pearl should meet. Well, as it turns out, she hated this play by Pearl. She never watches plays. She brings in pygmies from African countries and puts them in her space, and they do their performances. And she brings in these exotic performers from places you never even heard of or imagined and does them, but never watches their performance. But I persuaded her to sit and watch this play that I brought her down for, and she hated it so much she was convinced she'll never do it again. But anyway, her lesson to me was you should always pick people and not their property. And that's sort of been a guiding principle for Seven Stages. We didn't know it at the time, but that's how we were operating, that we did want to pick the director with the idea or the playwright who had to say something and wanted to work with them more than we wanted to read their play and see what the play is and sort of engage as property and royalties and like that. And so by dealing with our writers and directors in that way, it always keeps things sort of away from the superficial economic level and need, and always on the more aesthetic and spiritual end of things. So yeah, was that a partial answer to that?
Yeah. I think that answers.
Yeah, and so about going into on the daily basis, because everybody's asking me that question, of course, especially at the theater, and it's too early to tell, to be honest, like you said in the question, but I like the idea of not having to go in every day and worry about why don't people like us, or how come the funding situation is so dire, and those kind of things. What I don't like is that I've now put that over on the shoulders of some very close friends of ours. You probably know that in the nonprofit business, the new leader usually gets hired by a national search, and we chose not to do that because I think we have two really great leaders in our organization, and I wanted them to sort of take over the reins, not doing what we're doing, but in their own terms. And so, although Seventh Stage has been successful in so many ways through the years, one way we have failed is through the establishment of a debt or deficit debt. And so, we've got $170,000 debt that I built up over my leadership that I'm walking away from. And now these people I respect and admire and love are having to take that on and try to manage that debt. And that was something that for the last 10 years I worried about every day, because we didn't have a deficit until 10 years ago. And now they're having to worry about it. And the truth is, there aren't corporations or foundations or individuals really wanting to give money to a debt, because it's perceived that that means you failed if you somehow are in debt. And so we've got this lingering amount that is just overwhelming everybody and depressing everybody. Doesn't matter if we're doing good performances or if the houses are sold out. At the end of the year, we still have a debt. And what's maddening is that, because we own the building where we also live, and that has a certain kind of value, when you look at our financial situation, it looks like we're in pretty good shape, because as an asset-based organization, we're okay. But every year, we need $50,000 or $100,000 more for programming in order to stay afloat. So that I thought would be liberating, but in fact, it just makes me feel bad for what I've done to my friends, if that makes sense. And happily, so far, the friends want us to continue with our work and develop more projects with them. So hopefully, I will be able to continue to try to reduce that nut.
Is there anything else that you would like to say or make sure is included before we wrap up?
No, except maybe yes. I guess so many issues that we could talk about. LGBT issues are also something important, and I would put them as sort of like a par with racism, because we've done so many plays that have to do with that general subject, from everything from growing up stories by Grimsley, like Dream Boy, to a very intense, another play by Grimsley, in fact, called In Berlin, which I don't know if you saw, but that was his experiment going to Berlin.
Yes, we saw. And
the underground masochistic scene he encountered there. So that wasn't very pleasant for me. But in terms of who walks in our doors, I would say there are so many people in the gay community who need theater and art as a means to express themselves, and that's really where I see the future of Seven Stages, is keeping that interest alive. But also the transgender community, which I'm now learning about, has interests and needs that are really theatrical. So,
and I think they're different, oftentimes, from traditional LGBT. Even though there's a T in LGBT now, there are issues that are different. And
absolutely.
I think that awareness is just coming into being.
We did a play a couple of years ago, I think they mentioned to you, by Turner Schofield, called How to Become a Man in 129 Easy Steps or something. And so this was his performance about changing gender. And that was interesting enough, and the performance was wonderful, and we did it 3 or 4 times since then. But what was really the most interesting thing was a peripheral side benefit, which was that during the course of his performances, the bathrooms were an issue, obviously, because where do the trans people go? That's one question. But also, what are the people who are not trans, who are standing in the room with the obvious wrong person sex in there, how do they interrelate to all that? So Turner came up with a brilliant idea, which was we simply put up signs acknowledging that you may have a stranger standing next to you in the room, but it's just part of the deal. And it was wonderful. People loved that.
There's a play in that.
There is a play in that, you're right. Standing in the bathroom play. Well, our last performance was in front of the bathrooms of Seven Stages. Did Faye mention it?
No.
So Michael Haverty organized, our new director, organized an interactive festival about a month ago. And he brought in various groups to do performances around the theater that were interactive in nature. And so Faye and I decided that we were going to become two characters from Eastern Europe who were artistic directors, and they lost their jobs abroad, but they had heard that there was a job at Seven Stages available. So we talked to the Seven Stages directors about it, and they said, well, if you start from the beginning, we can maybe find a way for you to work yourselves up. So we created these characters who speak like this, and we stood in front of the bathrooms, and people came by. And so this came from the experience we first had traveling in Europe, when there actually were people who collected coins when you went to the bathroom, and it was their job in these communist countries to clean the toilets, but also to collect the coins. So we would demand coins from our people at Seven Stages. People were freaked out about it. Some people went and complained to Rob at the cafe, and some people stood and just glared at us, and then finally they realized, oh, it's like a performance. Oh, I'm supposed to interact with them. So the end of the performance was, I have all these coins that we've collected from various countries. So after tolerating this forced interaction that they have to pay money, a few pennies to get into the toilet, then when they're leaving, then they get to pick a lucky coin from the international selection. And then they piece it all together and they look at you, and it's just this wonderful audience to artist engagement that you don't get when you're on the stage. You know, when a person in the audience gets what you're doing, it's like when you get a joke, you know. They look at you with these eyes like, oh, yes. So to me, I think Faye and I are going to go back and be the toilet people from now on. So when you come to Seven Stages, we will be there.
Bring my coins.
I will be there in my fake beard, and Faye will have her sandals.
Wow.
Yeah.
Wow. Great. Well, thank you very much, Del. This was very enlightening, great, and I know we're going to be doing a joint interview with you and Faye as well.
I look forward to that.
In the
I
future,
feel like
but
there's
this
so
was
many
great.
superficial things are said, and but yes, that's good.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you.